Okay, so this is an introduction to Thomas Malory, whose Le Morte d'Arthur published 1485. Okay, so Malory is broadly interested in why Arthur's Round Table, another instance of metonymy, part for whole, is destroyed, even after it appears to have supernatural or magical aid in being established. So Malory also, however, is responding to events going on in his lifetime. You might have heard of the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1485, between two warring factions of the same extended family. Both the Lancasters and the Yorks could trace their lineage back to Edward III, who was king until 1377. Chaucer worked for him when he was a young man. I've got a Game of Thrones reference here because Martin, the author of those books, has claimed to have been inspired by the dynastic struggles in England in the 1400s. So, Act 1, Wars of the Roses. In 1399, Richard II, a grandson of Edward III, is deposed by Henry IV, whose father was the Duke of Lancaster, who was also a grandson of Edward III's, but he was not next in line for the throne. There was another descendant of Edward III's who had a superior or equal claim to the throne as Henry IV did. His name was Edmund Mortimer, who was the great-great-grandson of Edward III's oldest son, Duke of York. So Henry IV has Henry V, and then Henry VI, who's a Lancaster, who has a nervous breakdown in 1453, and Edward IV, who is Duke of York, moves in. Henry VI gets better in 1470 to 71 and comes back to the throne. But Edward IV comes back again, takes over, and Henry VI mysteriously dies in the Tower of London. Our author Malory, Thomas Malory, is apparently a gang leader during this time of civil war. So, Act 2, Edward IV, who is of York, dies in 1483. His son Edward is only 12 years old, and so his protector and uncle, Richard III of York, takes the crown, metonymy again, and probably murders or has murdered Edward and his younger brother in the Tower of London. These are the so-called lost princes in the Tower, whose bones they found, they believe their bones, they're not sure, several years ago. Richard III of York is defeated by Henry VII, a Lancaster, at the famous battle, Bosworth. If you visited this area 10 years ago, as I did, the historical markers were actually wrong, and they located both the actual battle site and the remains of Richard III himself were found under a parking lot in 2013. DNA testing proved that he was not hunchbacked, as Shakespeare represents him, but he had scoliosis. He had blue eyes and blonde hair, and he had roundworm, which was apparently common and comes from food having been prepared by people who haven't washed their hands after going to the bathroom. Of course, they had no bathrooms. They could find by doing tests on his bones that 25% of his diet was fish, which was quite low, meaning he is of the nobility, so he's eating a lot of meat. Okay, so the consequences of the Wars of the Roses is basically, these 30 years of battles came close to destroying the notion of hereditary monarchy. All of the principal characters involved were part of the royal or high nobility, but the danger is that every time you have a need for a new king, you'll end up having a civil war. Now, Thomas Malory of Newbold Revel, that's his house in the top photo, apparently fought for both sides, and he was in and out of prison depending upon who was in control, whether it was the York or the Lancasters. So the big mystery is why a so-called wealthy landed gentleman or lord of the manor turned to a life of crime, which included but was not limited to attempted murder of a neighboring duke, stealing livestock, extortion with menace, rape, twice the same woman, robbing a monastery, and it goes on. He says that he writes as a, quote, night prisoner, and he died in Newgate Prison in London in 1471. The bottom drawing there is just a reconstruction of what they think the rooms might have looked like. So as you read, you might consider what I think is really the main question in this legend in terms of Malory's version of it. That is, why does Arthur's civilization fall? People have often called the myth a tragedy, and so it might be useful to sort of recall what we mean by that. And so in terms of literary tragedy, we usually follow the way Aristotle defines it. He says, a tragedy involves the fall from high to low of a prominent character. Why do you have to be prominent? That is, powerful, aristocratic, etc., because your fall affects other people, or it has to affect other people for it to be a tragedy. Hamartia is what you often think of as a tragic flaw, but it can be a mistake. It's not necessarily a flaw. It could be simply an error, right? A tragedy should involve reversal in the sense that you're trying to do the right thing and the opposite of what you try to do happens. And it should also involve recognition. That is, the principal character, right, should recognize that the opposite of what they tried to do is what in fact has happened. Oedipus Rex is really the sort of classic example that Aristotle bases the way he defines tragedy. Oedipus does everything possible not to kill his father and sleep with his mother. And everything he does leads him right into his mother's arms. All right, thanks for listening.